This is my 50th year on national television and my 35th year on this show.
Bob Barker was the famously brilliant host who helmed The Price is Right for 35 solid years. Under his watch, the show didn't just survive, it exploded. It became a television institution. Then, in 2007, without much warning, Barker packed up his things and walked away. For years, people thought they knew why. Retirement, age, a graceful exit, simple explanations that felt neat and comfortable. But the truth wasn't neat, and it definitely wasn't comfortable. So why did Bob Barker really leave the show that gave him fame, power, and steady income? What was actually going on behind the scenes when the cameras stopped rolling? And why did it take so long for the real story to come out? Join us as we get into all the details. How The Price is Right quietly became the most powerful game show on TV. There's a reason The Price is Right doesn't feel like a television show. It feels like a place where time slows down, prices matter, and strangers suddenly believe they might walk out with a car, a vacation, or a brand new living room set just for guessing right. That feeling didn't happen by accident. It was engineered, carefully, quietly, and over decades. When The Price is Right returned to television in 1972, it wasn't starting from scratch. The concept already existed, dating back to the 1950s. But this version, this one was different. It leaned harder into spectacle. Bigger prizes, flashier reveals, games that felt simple on the surface but punished hesitation and rewarded nerve. Most importantly, it centered the audience. Not actors, not celebrities. Regular people pulled straight from the crowd, hearing their names called out with that now legendary phrase, "Come on down." It was loud, it was sudden, and it turned everyday shoppers into instant competitors. That choice changed everything. From the start, the show understood one crucial truth. People love watching other people try to guess prices, especially when the stakes feel just out of reach. Groceries, appliances, cars, things viewers recognized from their own lives, now inflated into moments of suspense. And standing in the middle of it all was Bob Barker. Barker didn't overpower the format. He anchored it. Calm, deliberate, and sharp, he let the chaos swirl around him while he controlled the pace. He knew when to pause, when to smile, when to let a contestant hang just long enough before revealing whether they'd won or lost. That rhythm became the show's heartbeat. Behind Barker, the structure locked into place. Every episode followed the same underlying pattern, even when viewers didn't consciously notice it. 4 contestants were brought down from the audience. 1 item up for bid. The closest without going over moves forward. No shortcuts, no complicated maths, just instinct, nerve, and timing. That opening round, known to fans as Contestants' Row, became a pressure cooker. The longer someone stood there without winning, the more desperate their bids became. The audience felt it. The cameras lingered on it. The tension built without anyone ever saying a word. Once a contestant broke through, the show shifted gears. Pricing games were where The Price is Right really flexed its creativity. Some were brutally simple, forcing contestants to choose between 2 options with almost no room for strategy. Others layered chance and skill, rewarding careful observation and punishing overthinking. Cars became the ultimate prize, dangling just far enough away to feel possible. And crucially, the games kept changing. Some stuck around for decades, others disappeared quietly when they stopped working. The rotation grew until the show had dozens of games to pull from. ensuring no two episodes ever felt exactly the same. Viewers didn't need to know the rules in advance. They learnt by watching week after week, absorbing the logic without realizing it. That's part of why the show lasted. Then came the wheel. The Showcase Showdown didn't just raise the stakes, it rewired the episode. Suddenly, everything that came before mattered. Contestants spun a massive vertical wheel, watching it slow, click by click, daring it to stop in the right place. A perfect dollar earned cheers. A spin over the limit brought groans. It was visual tension at its purest. By the time the final two contestants reached the showcase, the episode had done its work. Viewers were invested. They understood the rules. They knew the risks. When the prizes rolled out, sometimes tied together with silly themes or exaggerated skits, it felt like a payoff rather than a gimmick. Bid too high, and you lost everything. Bid too low, and you watched someone else walk away with your dream. That cruelty was part of the appeal. Off camera, the operation ran like a machine. Episodes were taped in batches. The audience was warmed up before filming even began. Announcers worked the crowd. Energy had to be sustained across multiple episodes in a single day, which meant precision mattered. Mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they were expensive. Despite its casual tone, the show was anything but loose. As the years passed, The Price is Right quietly stacked milestones. Thousands of episodes, millions of contestants, generations of viewers who grew up watching it in the background, then found themselves screaming at the TV as adults. The set became iconic. Studio 33 at Television City wasn't just a filming location. It was part of the show's identity. The bright colors, the familiar layout, the feeling that stepping inside meant stepping into television history. Meanwhile, the show adapted without calling attention to itself. Inflation changed how people guessed prices. Online shopping altered how viewers thought about value. Studies later showed that bidding accuracy shifted over time, reflecting the economy itself. The show didn't comment on those changes. It absorbed them. That was the trick. Even when production schedules shifted, when episodes aired out of order, and when special episodes or sponsor giveaways altered the flow, the core stayed intact. 4 contestants, 1 bid, 6 games, 2 spins, 1 final gamble. By the time the show crossed the 10,000 episode mark, it wasn't just surviving, it was setting records. Longest-running game show in American television. One of the longest-running network series, period. Awards followed. Industry recognition arrived. Hall of Fame inductions acknowledged what audiences already knew. This wasn't just a daytime distraction. It was a blueprint. And at the center of that blueprint stood Bob Barker. Not as a fading figure, but as a steady constant. A host who understood that the show didn't need reinvention. It needed discipline, consistency, and just enough surprise to keep people leaning forward. The show had outgrown trends, outlasted competitors, and it embedded itself so deeply into television culture that it no longer needed hype to prove its worth. It just needed to keep rolling. And it did. Before the fame, how Bob Barker became Bob Barker. Long before Bob Barker became the calm voice at the center of American mornings, before the suits, the stage lights, and the polished pauses, he was a boy growing up far from television studios and applause. Bob Barker was born on December 12, 1923, in the small logging town of Darrington, Washington. It wasn't a place built for ambition or spectacle. His childhood didn't unfold under spotlights. It unfolded on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in Mission, South Dakota, where his mother taught school and where community mattered more than recognition. Barker grew up knowing exactly where he came from. His father, a foreman on the electrical high line, carried Sioux heritage. His mother did not. That made Bob 1/8 Sioux, a detail he never treated casually or quietly. He attended grade school on the reservation, sitting in classrooms where his own mother taught, absorbing a sense of identity that stayed with him for life. He would later say he always bragged about being part Indian, not as a footnote, but as a source of pride. To him, the Sioux weren't just history. They were strength, warriors, survivors. That belief shaped the way he carried himself. Calm on the surface, steel underneath. As a teenager, Barker's life took a turn that felt almost cinematic. While attending high school in Missouri, he went to an Ella Fitzgerald concert and met a girl named Dorothy Jo Gideon. He was 15. They started dating young, the kind of relationship people assume won't last. It did. That steadiness followed him everywhere. College came next. Barker earned a basketball scholarship to Drury College in Springfield, Missouri. He joined a fraternity, studied economics, and balanced academics with athletics. But what quietly pulled at him wasn't sports or numbers. It was sound, voices, the rhythm of conversation. While still a student, he took his first media job at a small radio station, KTTS-FM. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't pay much, but it taught him something essential: how to speak so people wanted to keep listening. World War II interrupted everything. In 1943, Barker joined the U.S. Navy Reserve to train as a fighter pilot. He didn't see combat, but the discipline stuck. On January 12, 1945, while on leave, he married Dorothy Jo. No spectacle, no delay. Just commitment, sealed early and carried forward. After the war, Barker returned to college, finished strong, and graduated summa cum laude with a degree in economics. By then, radio wasn't a side job anymore. It was the plan. He and Dorothy Jo moved to Florida, where Barker worked as a news editor and announcer at a small AM station. Again, no spotlight, just repetition. Hours behind a microphone, learning how to sound confident without sounding loud. That pattern followed him west. In 1950, Barker moved to California, chasing opportunity the way so many broadcasters did, without guarantees or safety nets. He landed his own radio program, The Bob Barker Show, which ran for 6 years. It wasn't just about music or headlines, it was audience participation, call-ins, interaction, real people responding in real time. That detail mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because one day, while Barker was hosting an audience participation show on KNX in Los Angeles, a producer happened to be listening. Ralph Edwards liked Barker's voice. He liked the pace. He liked how Barker made ordinary people feel comfortable speaking up. Edwards was looking for a new host for truth or consequences. And just like that, Barker stepped into television. He began hosting the show at the end of 1956 and stayed with it for nearly 2 decades. That's where he learned how to manage unpredictability, how to handle contestants who froze, rambled, or went off script, how to keep things moving without rushing, how to recover when something didn't land. Those years were his training ground. By the early 1970s, television was shifting again. Game shows were being rethought, modernized, and sharpened for a new audience. Producers Mark Goodson and Bill Todman began developing a revived version of The Price is Right. The nighttime syndicated version landed first. The daytime slot, though, was trickier. CBS wanted a host who didn't feel tied to a rival network. Dennis James was already seen as NBC's guy. Barker, steady and familiar, fit the bill. He began hosting The Price is Right in September 1972, while still finishing his run on Truth or Consequences. The transition wasn't flashy. It was surgical. Barker adjusted his tone, slowed his delivery, and let the show breathe. As the years rolled on, Barker became more than a host. He became part of the machinery that kept television humming. He hosted the Pillsbury Bake-Off. He co-hosted parade coverage. He showed up where networks needed reliability. And he became a surprisingly effective guest star. He appeared on game shows, talk shows, and sitcoms, often playing himself, leaning into the public image without mocking it. In 1996, he shocked audiences by beating up Adam Sandler in Happy Gilmore, a moment so unexpected it reintroduced Barker to an entirely new generation. The joke worked because it cut against everything people thought they knew about him. That balance, polite on the surface and unafraid underneath, defined his career. Even when Barker appeared in animated shows, soap operas, or wrestling broadcasts, the same thing held true. He didn't chase relevance. He let relevance come to him. Through it all, he stayed recognizable. The voice, the posture, the quiet authority. Even when he stopped dyeing his hair in the late 1980s and let it go gray, it felt less like a cosmetic decision and more like a statement. This is who I am. Take it or leave it. By the time Barker was firmly established as one of television's most familiar faces, it was clear his success hadn't been accidental. It was built slowly, intentionally, brick by brick, microphone by microphone. He didn't arrive loudly. He arrived ready. And by the time America noticed, he was already impossible to replace. The women who shaped Bob Barker's life, not the headlines. Before Bob Barker ever stood beneath studio lights, before applause followed him into rooms, before strangers recognized his voice, before his face, he already knew what commitment looked like. He was 15 when it found him. Bob Barker met Dorothy Jo Gideon at Cathedral High School in Springfield, Missouri. He was new. She was familiar. And when he asked her out, it wasn't to a soda shop or a football game. It was to an Ella Fitzgerald concert. Even then, he leaned toward elegance over noise. What started as teenage dating never burnt out. It deepened. They stayed inseparable through school, through uncertainty, through the long stretches when Bob chased a future that hadn't quite revealed itself yet. When World War II arrived, Bob joined the U.S. Navy to train as a fighter pilot. He didn't see combat, but the war pressed urgency into everything. So, while on leave, in January 1945, Bob and Dorothy eloped. Bob was 21. Dorothy was 20. And they stayed married for 35 years, right up until the end. Later in life, Bob would talk about Dorothy with a clarity that never faded. He once reflected that she was with him through everything, until the day she died. He didn't romanticize it. He stated it like a fact. For some men, he acknowledged, second or third marriages worked. For him, there was only one. Dorothy Jo was the love of his life. That certainty shaped how Bob lived. They didn't have children. And unlike so many people who hedge that truth with excuses, Bob never softened it. He said plainly that they didn't have time for children, and he didn't regret it. He observed that many of his friends were struggling with parenthood, then added, almost casually, that he had 13 ducks to care for, and that was already a lot of work. It sounded like humor, but it wasn't flippant. It was perspective. What Bob didn't always say outright was how deeply Dorothy influenced the man he became. Her compassion wasn't performative. It was consistent. She stopped wearing fur coats before it was fashionable to do so. She became a vegetarian before it entered mainstream conversation. She loved animals with an intensity that didn't need applause. Bob watched. Slowly, he followed. He didn't switch overnight. He transitioned alongside her, one habit at a time, one meal at a time. He later said he owed his vegetarianism to Dorothy, and he meant it. He believed it improved his life. He believed it helped him work longer. He believed it grounded him in a way fame never could. In 1979, when Bob began ending each episode of The Price is Right with a reminder to spay and neuter pets, it wasn't branding. It was devotion made public. Then came the loss. Dorothy was a heavy smoker. In 1981, she was diagnosed with lung cancer. 6 months later, she was gone. She was 57. People close to Bob said the man who emerged afterward wasn't the same. His half-brother later described a deep depression, a version of Bob that withdrew for years. Bob himself said he would never marry again. Not out of bitterness, out of loyalty. Dorothy had been his marriage. And yet, life found a way to bring companionship back into his orbit. 2 years after Dorothy's death, Bob met Nancy Burnett at an animal adoption event. Bob was co-hosting. Nancy wasn't starstruck. In fact, she didn't even realize who he was. What caught her attention wasn't television fame. It was his mission, the spay-neuter campaign, the seriousness behind it. That shared purpose became the bridge. Their relationship wasn't loud. It didn't chase headlines. It grew through shared work, shared concern, and shared outrage when animals were mistreated. Even on vacation, advocacy followed them. If there was an animal issue nearby, they were involved. On one trip to the Cayman Islands, they helped organize a protest against a circus coming to town. Nancy later joked that the locals were probably relieved to see them leave. On another trip, in Hawaii, they found an injured pit bull begging for food. Nancy called animal control. Bob backed her without hesitation. That was how they moved through the world. Together, but never flashy. Bob proposed to Nancy more than once. He wanted marriage again. Nancy didn't. She loved him deeply, but she was content with companionship as it was. They never lived together. They kept separate homes. It worked because it respected who they both were. According to Bob's longtime publicist, Nancy was the only woman he would have married again. And even without a ring, she became his anchor. She also carried some of his favorite memories. Nancy once recalled a moment from The Price is Right that still made Bob laugh. In June 1980, a young contestant named Vanna White appeared on the show, long before she became a fixture on Wheel of Fortune. Bob noticed her watching herself in the monitor. He stopped her, gently but directly, telling her to pay attention to the game instead of her reflection. It was classic Bob. Observant, precise, unimpressed by surfaces. Years later, when asked what message Bob would want to leave fans with, Nancy didn't hesitate. The same one he'd been delivering for decades. Spay and neuter your pets. She hoped for a future where people wouldn't even need the reminder. The fact that it was still necessary said everything. Nancy was also the one who made sure Bob was cared for in his final years. Around-the-clock care. No shortcuts, no delegating. She ensured he stayed in the same home he'd lived in since the 1950s, surrounded by familiarity, until the end. Those close to him called her devotion extraordinary, singular. Bob Barker's story is often told through television milestones, through catchphrases, through applause. But the quieter truth is this: everything he became was shaped first by love. One that arrived early, one that never left him, and one that, even after loss, redirected his life toward something larger than himself. What really went wrong behind the scenes of The Price is Right. By the late 1980s, Bob Barker wasn't just a television host. He was power. By then, The Price is Right had become untouchable, and Barker sat firmly at the center of it. He wasn't just the face audiences trusted. He was the man whose word carried weight behind the scenes. Creative decisions, personnel choices, public messaging. The line between host and authority had blurred. And when someone with that much influence takes a public stand, the consequences ripple. Barker had always been outspoken about animal welfare, but in the late 1980s, that advocacy turned confrontational. He publicly accused the American Humane Society and United Activists for Animal Rights of condoning animal cruelty on film sets, pointing specifically to the movie Project X. His claims were explosive. He alleged that a cattle prod and a gun were allowed on set and referenced rumors that a chimpanzee had been beaten during production. It wasn't a quiet disagreement, it was a public indictment. American Humane didn't back down. They responded by filing a $10 million lawsuit against Barker for libel, slander, and invasion of privacy, claiming his accusations were part of a 2-year vendetta. Full-page advertisements followed. Public statements challenged Barker's version of events, arguing that his claims were based on misleading or incomplete information. For the first time in years, Barker wasn't controlling the narrative. The lawsuit ended quietly. Barker's insurance company settled for $300,000. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown and no public apology. But the damage lingered. The image of Bob Barker as a universally admired moral authority now carried shadows. And that wouldn't be the last time. In 1994, the tension spilled directly onto the set of The Price is Right. Former model Diane Parkinson filed a lawsuit against Barker, alleging sexual harassment stemming from a 3-year affair during her time on the show. She claimed she was pressured and extorted, saying her job security was used as leverage. The headlines were brutal. Barker denied wrongdoing. Parkinson later dropped the lawsuit, saying the stress of the battle was damaging her health. The case ended without a verdict, without closure, and without answers that satisfied the public. But the allegation alone cracked something open. Because once that door opened, more stories followed. In 1995, longtime model Holly Hallstrom left the show. Officially, her departure was attributed to weight gain linked to medication. Hallstrom told a different story. She sued Barker, alleging she was fired not because of her appearance, but because she refused to lie to the media about the Parkinson lawsuit. According to Hallstrom, Barker wanted her to provide false information publicly, and when she refused, she paid the price. Barker countersued for slander. This time, the outcome shifted. Hallstrom prevailed and later received a settlement in 2005. No press conference, no sweeping vindication, just a quiet acknowledgement that her claims couldn't be dismissed. By then, the atmosphere around the show had changed. What once felt like a perfectly oiled machine now carried whispers, stories of tension backstage, of fear, of loyalty tests. People began describing a workplace where power was concentrated and dissent came at a cost. That perception hardened in 2007 when CBS employee Deborah Curling filed a lawsuit against CBS Barker and the show's producers. She claimed she was forced out after testifying against Barker in a wrongful termination case and described an intolerable backstage environment. She also alleged racial discrimination. Legally, the case went nowhere. Barker was removed from the lawsuit. The claims were dismissed. Appeals failed. But reputations don't operate on court rulings alone. By the late 2000s, Bob Barker's legacy had become complicated. To viewers, he was still the steady voice reminding them to spay and neuter their pets. To insiders, he was a man whose influence shaped careers, for better or worse. The truth lived somewhere in between. Barker wasn't a cartoon villain, and he wasn't the flawless icon people once believed him to be. He was a powerful figure who believed deeply in his causes, expected loyalty, and didn't always tolerate resistance well. The real reason Bob Barker left The Price is Right. When Bob Barker finally walked away from The Price is Right, most people assumed they already knew why. Age, fatigue, a graceful exit after decades of dominance. It was the kind of explanation that felt comfortable, logical, clean. But it wasn't the full story. For nearly 35 years, Bob Barker was the show. Not the mascot, not the face, the backbone. From 1972 to 2007, his voice, his pauses, and his authority shaped what daytime television looked like. He wasn't even the show's first host, but by the time his run ended, it barely mattered. The earlier version felt like a footnote. Barker's era was the identity. What people forget is that Barker almost didn't take the job at all. When CBS revived The Price is Right in the early 1970s, it was part of a larger game show slate. Barker reportedly felt the other two shows were better produced and more promising. He hesitated. Producers didn't. They believed his temperament, his patience, and his command of an audience were perfect for a show built on suspense and restraint. They were right. The other shows faded. The Price is Right didn't just survive. It outgrew everything around it. And for a long time, the unspoken belief inside the industry was simple. If Barker ever left, the show would collapse. That belief kept him there longer than most people realize. Even as he aged, Barker resisted stepping aside. He didn't hide the years either. He stopped dyeing his hair. Let it go white. Let the audience watch him age in real time. It wasn't vanity. It was defiance. He stayed because he loved the show. And when he finally announced his retirement, he later admitted he regretted it almost immediately. So, why leave at all? Contrary to the rumors that followed him for years, Barker didn't leave because of failing health. He didn't leave because he was pushed out. According to him, he left because he wanted to go while he still felt respected and still in control of the decision. By the time he made that call in 2006, Barker had filmed over 6,400 episodes and won 17 Emmy Awards. He wasn't limping toward the finish line. He was standing at the peak, looking down, and choosing the moment himself. That mattered to him more than people realized. His final episode was taped in June 2007. CBS scrambled to find a successor and eventually landed on Drew Carey, a choice that made sense on paper but came with enormous pressure. Carey wasn't just replacing a host. He was stepping into a cultural institution. And Barker was watching. Just not the way people expected. In 2009, when Good Morning America asked Barker if he still watched the show, his answer stopped people cold. He said he sometimes tuned in for a game or two, but he wasn't a loyal viewer. That was it. Calm, casual, honest. The internet didn't take it calmly. People jumped to conclusions. Was he unhappy? Bitter? Disappointed with the new version? Another interview resurfaced where Barker observed that Carey did the show differently and suggested the games didn't feel as exciting anymore, that they were simply being played instead of presented. It sounded like criticism. It wasn't meant to be. Barker later clarified that he wasn't attacking Carey, CBS, or the show. In fact, he had every incentive for the show to succeed. He still received a sizable royalty check. The longer The Price is Right ran, the better it was for him. What Barker was really doing was something far more revealing. He was emotionally distancing himself. He didn't want to sit at home watching a version of the show that no longer belonged to him. Not because it was bad, but because it was different. And Barker had always believed that when you leave something, you leave it fully. That philosophy explains what happened next. In 2012, The Price is Right celebrated its 40th anniversary. Barker wasn't on stage. People noticed. Rumors followed. But Barker brushed it off. He said he was fine with being excluded. Then he explained why. He had publicly criticized the show's producers for offering prizes tied to SeaWorld and the Calgary Stampede, both of which he described as notorious for animal abuse. For Barker, this wasn't a side issue. It was a line he wouldn't cross. If the show was going to move in directions he fundamentally disagreed with, he didn't want to stand beside it and smile. That's the part people miss. Bob Barker didn't leave because he stopped caring. He left because he cared too much to stay while losing influence over what the show represented. And yet, despite everything, there was no scorched earth. Barker returned to the show 3 times after retiring. Once in 2009 to promote his autobiography. Again in 2013 for his 90th birthday. And finally, in 2015, during an April Fool's episode, he took the mic, ran the intro, hosted the first game, and then handed control back to Carrie. It was symbolic, intentional, a reminder that he could still do it, and proof that he'd left on his own terms. Behind the scenes, Barker's health had already begun complicating things. Over the years, he endured strokes, surgeries, falls, and cancer scares. None of them pushed him out when he was on the show. He always came back. But they reinforced the same truth he'd acted on in 2006. Time doesn't wait, and dignity matters. His final public interview came in 2021, when he spoke calmly about the show's 50th season. No bitterness, no regrets, just distance. When Barker died in August 2023 at the age of 99, it was revealed that he'd lived for years with Alzheimer's disease, a condition kept private by those closest to him. It was the final confirmation that his instinct to step away early had been right. So the real reason Bob Barker left The Price is Right wasn't scandal or exhaustion or loss of relevance. It was control. Control over his legacy. Control over the moment. Control over how the story ended. Were you a fan of The Price is Right? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.